We are live on Facebook.
Good evening to our friends in Kabul, good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good morning to my friends here in the United States. My name is Jennifer Murtazashvili, and I'm a professor of international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, from where I speak to you today. It is an enormous pleasure and honor to welcome you to this very important panel organized by the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies to discuss a new paper that is just being released today. The paper is called An Assessment of the Possibility of Producing Consensus Within the Parliamentary and Decentralized System of Democracy in Afghanistan. The paper is written by Dr. Mohammed Amin Ahmadi, who is one of Afghanistan's most distinguished scholars in Islamic jurisprudence and constitutional issues. Dr. Ahmadi is a member of the negotiating team of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan that has represented the Republic at peace talks with the Taliban in Doha. He has had a number of important roles throughout his career and is currently serving as the Chancellor and Professor at Avicenna University in Kabul. Although Dr. Ahmadi is not with us today, I encourage all of you to read this very important paper, which is one of the most thoughtful and creative attempts to integrate the Islamic Republic with the goals of the Taliban. In this sense, the paper released by AISS today represents a concrete proposal towards a constitutional path for peace. To discuss these ideas, we have a distinguished panel of scholars from around the world, all with deep and eminent expertise on issues of governance and history of Afghanistan. So the order of the program, we have Dr. Hussain Yasa, who is the founder of the Afghanistan group of newspapers and served more than a decade as the editor-in-chief of the Daily Outlook in Afghanistan. He is a writer and a political analyst, and he's written many pieces on political and security affairs of Afghanistan and the region. He's an active participant of conference and many seminars on Afghan issues. Dr. Thomas Barfield is professor of anthropology at Boston University and president of the Afghanistan Institute of the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies. And he's the author of numerous books on Afghanistan, but most notably, Afghanistan, A Culture and Political History. Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi is a lecturer in international relations at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. He's the author of several books, including The Hazaras and the Afghan State, Rebellion, Exclusion, and the Struggle for Recognition. And finally, we have with us Dr. William Maley, who's emeritus professor, now congratulations, professor, of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at Australian National University. Dr. Maley and Dr. Ibrahimi have recently co-authored the new book, Afghanistan, Politics and Economics in a Globalizing State. We have a lot to discuss today. So I'll begin by asking a question of each of our panelists based on the themes outlined in this important paper. They'll speak for a few minutes before we move on to the next round of questions. So Dr. Yasa, let me begin with you. A central argument of Dr. Ahmadi's paper is that the current constitution, with some amendment, can build consensus among Republicans as well as with the Taliban. How do you assess this argument?
Although I must appreciate, first of all, thank you all of you and Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies. And then first of all, I appreciate Dr. Ahmadi with such a good work. And at least what I get from this paper and reach to the conclusion that the current system of Afghanistan, which is the presidential and the unitary system, is not working, and it's not, if I would say, it is not responsive to the ground realities of Afghanistan. That I appreciate. As far as he said that by some amendment, probably the Taliban and the other side, the Kabul government, they can reach to some sort of conclusion by some amendment, and we don't need any new constitution. There are some space for the amendment. That I think it is a little bit over optimism of Dr. Ahmadi, because as far as when we study the structure, organizational structure of Taliban and their ideological structures, and see that they did not speak yet, you see a single paragraph about their probable, about their vision or their you see, approach about the probable future polity, they don't say anything. So it means that they are not changed. And I think it will be a little bit over-optimism about the Taliban, though he has tried his best. And I read it. It's a good paper, and we will then we will discuss further when we will go a little bit ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yasa. Dr. Barfield, the paper argues that the Taliban cannot build political order on their own, that they need to rely on others in society, and this brings us back to the Constitution. Do you think that it's possible to integrate the Taliban and their political aspirations with that of the Republic? Do you think that that their goals and desires can be integrated with the current Constitution? Do you think that this Constitution can be preserved in the future?
Well, I think one of the greatest difficulties in Afghanistan is the constitutions have reflected the interest whoever write them. And so they're not really designed for talking about consensus. The one thing they all have in common is whether it's a king, a president, or a party chief, they've always been top down and incredibly centralized in terms of the secular government. In terms of the communists, with the Taliban, it was incredibly centralized with a religious government. I think the only thing that the Taliban and the writers of the current constitution agree upon is they would like to hold the top job. And I do think the paper raises a number of interesting issues later on. Is the difficulties of Afghanistan have been that its leadership position is so highly centralized, whether it's a king, commissar, or emir, that what we get is a desire to hold that top position and then impose the will of that ideology on the country. And I believe that's created disaster for Afghanistan under the communists. I think it created a disaster among the Taliban when they were in charge. And I don't think it's done Afghanistan very good to have such a high presidential system, because none of these constitutions, and it would be exaggeration to say the Taliban actually had a constitution when they were in charge. Well, what it's meant is the belief that any political movement that can hold power in Kabul can dictate to the rest of the country. And that's produced instability for the past 40 years. My concern is that the current constitution, without being rewritten, is so highly centralized that the fear is whoever gets power will impose themselves without the need of any consultation. And I believe that's a defect in the current constitution. So while I do think it can be amended, there becomes a certain point in which how many amendments does it take to create a new constitution?
So Professor Maley, do you think that this is an issue of constitutional or institutional design? Do you think that so many of the issues that are laid out and that we're discussing here today really are using institutions to build peace? Do you think that this is possible, that using this system, modifying the system can create and building consensus around institutions is a way forward to end the war?
I'm somewhat skeptical about the likelihood that that will flow. I think there are, in a sense, two strands of issues which are highlighted by the paper. On the one hand, there's the issue about the functionality of the existing constitutional framework, and I very much agree with what Tom has said about the challenges that arise from the degree of centralization that exists in the current constitution. And in a sense, that owes a lot also to decisions that were taken at the Bonn conference in 2001, which provided for up to 29 departments in the interim administration. So Afghanistan, in a way, was locked into a complex and substantial bureaucratic structure even before the drafting of the constitution itself came into prospect, essentially for political reasons, so the different factions could be locked into support for a new dispensation by getting some positional goods in the process. And the result has not been a happy one. I was involved in drafting a piece of good advice commissioned by the Center on International Cooperation at New York University in 2003 for the use of the Constitutional Drafting Commission, which highlighted some of the problems that could accompany a highly centralized presidential system. And I think the drafters paid not the slightest attention to what I or the other authors of papers in that series had to say, because it was a different kind of exercise. It was one in which certain people on the ground had a lot of sway, and the influence of the 1964 Constitution was probably excessive in shaping the character of the 2004 Constitution. That's one sort of issue, the functionality of the existing Constitution. There's then a slightly separate issue of whether a new constitutional framework could be put in place that would be sufficiently satisfactory from the Taliban's point of view that they would buy into a process that resulted in such a constitution, but also preserve enough of the existing framework, what's positive in the existing framework, to bridge the gap between the two parties. And that's where I'm actually quite skeptical, because I think a lot of the Taliban's vision has historically been totalitarian, with a kind of Führerprinzip underlying their approach to politics and administration, a non-constitutional approach to the exercise of power, as opposed to a much more pluralist model that the Republican system desirably would put in place, even if the existing constitutional framework has been very patchy in its achievements in that respect. And it doesn't seem to me that there's yet much indication that that gap between the Taliban and the proponents of a Republican model is likely to be bridged either through negotiation or any other process that's on the horizon just at the moment.
One of the Taliban's objections to the current constitution, especially the 2004 constitution, is that they see the constitution as an imposition by outsiders, and that it is inherently not legitimate. And so the paper suggests that reforming the current political order would require going back to the 1964 Constitution, which they argue is actually more, which Dr. Ahmadi argues is more democratic in many ways, and we'll talk about that point in a minute. But getting back to this point of religion, Dr. Ibrahimi, I think that one of the questions that's raised is this relationship between religion and politics, religion and the state. And one of the proposals made by Dr. Ahmadi is that Afghanistan moved to a parliamentary system, because a parliamentary system would allow for the indirect selection of political leaders, which he believes the Taliban would be more amenable to, that this is sort of more in line with their thinking about the way that leaders should be selected. And that this could be sort of a way to accommodate this difference. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this, sort of the accommodation of religious leaders, what role will the ulama play in this? Can the parliament function as a kind of ulama in this system? And what are your thoughts about these divergent roles, about the role of religion in the state?
Thank you, Professor Murtazashvili, and everyone else. Let me also join you in commending Dr. Amin Ahmadi for producing this really creative and imaginative paper on an issue that is, I think we all understand, quite complex. And I think he has put forward a proposal that deserves a lot more discussion and elaboration. And I'm quite happy to be part of this process here. I think, that whole debate about the role of religion, Islam in Afghanistan, is quite a central part of this paper by Dr. Amin Ahmadi. And he is essentially trying to resolve two main challenges that I think confronts Afghanistan as it tries to find a way to make peace with the Taliban. First, I think this issue of democracy versus theocracy. And the Taliban has attempted to produce and impose a model of Islamic Emirate in 1996 to 2001, which was one of the most conservative, authoritarian, theocratic orders Afghanistan, perhaps the world, has seen. And then the other debate is about centralization versus decentralization. And I think in that respect, I think many of us would agree there is a lot of agreement emerging in the scholarly literature that the current presidentialized system and the way it concentrates power in the office of one in one office in Kabul is producing many challenges that are, I think, contributing to the failure of governance and security that we have witnessed over the past 20 years in Afghanistan. So now, on that question of whether, in a new constitution, parliamentary democracy can resolve, the challenges of, religious, the role of religion in public life, I think there's so much more that I think has to be elaborated. The Taliban as a movement has been incredibly secretive in their thinking. They have revealed so much. Over the past few years, I think a couple of years in particular, we have seen what you may describe as this discursive shift with regard to the Taliban, which is trying to point to ways that Taliban have probably, hopefully, changed in the way they would like to see Afghanistan being governed in the future. But as we know, they haven't produced much. They were the first attempt in 1998 to create a constitution. There was something recently revealed to the media, leaked, and the Taliban denied having, owning that document as their charter for future government in Afghanistan. So I think there's very little that we know, while there is interest, hope for a transformed Taliban movement that will, accommodate the desire and governance needs of Afghanistan in the 21st century. And I think, like everybody else, quite skeptical, to see that the Taliban has changed. In fact, while the Taliban has written very little, and in fact, speak very little about what they would like to see, what their vision is for the future of Afghanistan, but we know how the Taliban behaves. From the history, but also in areas that they have controlled now, and we can see the impact of their, repressive policies coming back, having an impact on Afghan women's education in many parts of the country.
So now that the U.S. has announced its military withdrawal, I think it's hard to get through any conversation about Afghanistan without discussing this important point. Where do all of you see these negotiations going? Not just the negotiations about the peace agreement, obviously, is very important, or finding a path to peace, but this constitutional arrangement really requires political leaders to give up power, right? The proposal that we see by Dr. Ahmadi requires a weakened executive branch, and as Professor Barfield laid out, we have a very strong executive in Afghanistan, and that has been sort of consistent throughout history. So the political game is this sort of zero-sum contestation about who gains control of the state, and it becomes a very zero-sum game for everybody involved. Do you think that these peace negotiations, given that the U.S. is going to withdraw, changes those incentives to radically alter this constitutional system where you might have a power sharing agreement along the lines that this paper suggests? Dr. Yasa, I'll begin. I'll ask you to respond, and then if the others want to chime in, please do.
Yeah, unfortunately, as far as United States withdrawal is troops withdrawal is concerned, I won't comment on that, because Mr. Khalilzad has already summed up that United States doesn't want the permission of anybody to go to anywhere or to withdraw from somewhere. So their own priorities, why they came to Afghanistan and why they are leaving, they have their own, its own internal dimension or external dimension, whatever. But as far as Dr. Ahmadi's proposal is concerned, I once again appreciate him. There are a couple of important things, but something are missing. No doubt that Afghanistan needs a new social contract, and there should be some radical change in that approach which was there in 2001, and it was very, very badly manipulated with the people, as Professor Barfield, I think also he has mentioned in his book, that 2001, so much resources, new technology, international support, but the idea of statehood was from the 19th century. So, and probably that's why one of the prime reason that Taliban has become a very big challenge at the moment. But just keep in view that couple of years back when Taliban was not a big challenge. So again, there were a lot of challenges between the various communities, and nobody was very much comfortable with this sort of constitutional arrangement, which was based on nation state and very strong presidential and unitary state. Now, let me come to that, Dr. Ahmadi's once again. Dr. Ahmadi, okay, I'm also one of the strong advocates of consensus democracy, which Dr. Ahmadi says parliamentary form of democracy as well as proportional representation. That is good. What I missed there, that Dr. Ahmadi did not address the properly, I think, or effectively, the vertical distribution of power, which is very, very important. And over the period of the time, the natural, you see, zones of Afghanistan, which was developed over the centuries, was very brutally, all of those were divided into small provinces without any basic and positive approach. Like you have in a lot of countries, they have their own policies, like they increase the number of their administrative divisions or sometimes they decrease. But there are some static vision behind why we are increasing our administrative divisions or why we are decreasing. So now the way it was done from Amanullah Khan onward, Amanullah Khan, and then especially started very brutally during the Daud Khan time, and when he resigned, the new government came in 1963 for the first time, which is not very much discussed. We discussed too much the 1965's administrative, law, which shows Afghanistan with 28 provinces. In 1963, I found another decree that it was showing that Afghanistan already it was distributed in 29 provinces. So now, what was the approach? As many good people, they have already noticed this, that there was a very, very bad intention behind these divisions, and unless now you see, when you see any map of Afghanistan, demographic map, ethno-demographic map of Afghanistan, you may find, like in a big central Afghanistan, there is a by green color or by yellow color, this is the land of Hazaras, this is the land of Uzbeks in some areas, this is the land of Tajiks, this is the land of Pashtuns. Where are those? It doesn't, in our administrative system, it doesn't reflect. It was inhuman and unjust, which was very brutally designed to guarantee this domination, tribal domination in Afghanistan. I would suggest that this is the time, as far as Taliban are concerned, they share the same view as Mr. Ghani. One is playing with the Sharia, the other is playing with the republicanism. But you see, both of them are following the same strong nation-state theory. Ghani, in one way, and the Taliban, they don't mention the nation, they mention Ummah, which is Islamic word, 62 times it is mentioned in Quran Majid. So, but they follow the same strong centralized government, which is not compatible with the ground realities of Afghanistan. I would suggest that the geographical identities of the people, the native people of Afghanistan, should be returned to them. It was built over the centuries, and it was just lapsed couple of decades back, unless there won't be a proper system which would clearly tell you the vertical and the horizontal distribution of power. I don't think that any system would work in Afghanistan. And for example, if I'm not taking your time, for example, how would you accommodate Taliban in this system, in this unitary system? How would you accommodate that? So huge difference. I'm in touch with the people who are there in Doha. Sometimes they don't talk to them. See, sometimes when they say about the social justice, so then say this is the terminology of the infidels. We should talk about the Islamic justice. When you talk about democracy, forget about this. Americans are going, these all terminologies will go with them. When you talk about the religious, rights of the various people, they say, no, it is very difficult. We are only one Muslim brothers. So if you don't have a common language, if you don't have shared type of definitions of many things, how will you accommodate Taliban? This is only possible in the federal system. Theoretically, now what will happen to Afghanistan? I don't know. I don't see a very smooth future, but there is the parliamentary form of democracy, consensus democracy is not enough. Federal parliamentary form of system is the only way to solve the problem once for all. Thank you very much.
Professor Barfield, I know you've got a lot to say on this and you've written quite a bit on this. I'm just curious to hear your response.
One of the things is to recognize the difference between de facto structures of power and de jure ones, and the constitutional ones are set up. That's the law. And I do agree that it was a deliberate policy to increase the number of provinces to actually make local administration more problematic. Afghanistan has historically been 4, 5, 6 major regions going all the way back to the Persian Empire. Each of them has a central city, whether it be Kandahar, Herat, Mazar, Kabul, that have been there for a really long time. I think one of the things that's likely to happen in terms of devolution of power is that neither the Taliban right now nor Ashraf Ghani are interested in devolving any power. The question is what happens. Right now, the Taliban believe if the Americans are leaving, then they'll take over. Why make any compromises? The question that comes, and I am reminded when the Soviets withdrew, there was also a similar enthusiasm on the part of the Mujahideen that they would be in Kabul within 6 months, and they were not. And the Najib regime did not collapse until after the Soviet Union did. So one of the questions happens is what happens when both sides find that they cannot seize absolute power? And in particular, I think whether it becomes an actual civil war or just a reorganization for local protection, the regions of Afghanistan will be looking to protect themselves, at which point within the Taliban, will there be a difference of people who will fight to the last man to create a centralized emirate, and which of the local Taliban would be more interested in negotiating some kind of power sharing agreement? And the reason that you would then not have necessarily a high executive is that neither side would want it. If there is no singular power in charge of Kabul to take, then it's dangerous for either side to trust the other one holding that position. But that's only likely to happen in a stalemate. If the Taliban feel that they cannot, that there'll be another 10 years in the wilderness, and people in Kabul think we need to end this war, at that point, President Ghani has said, admittedly under different conditions, that he would be willing to step down. There may be some people that will take him at his word. At which point, the agreement will not be, if it's to be lasting, who's going to be the supreme leader to replace Ashraf Ghani on a different basis, but rather that neither side would trust the other with that much executive power. If that's the case, then what we would see is sort of a de facto regionalism, which is certainly, if we look at the United States, the states have tremendous amount of sovereign power locally, but they rely on the national government for many important things. Same thing could happen with Afghanistan. There are a lot of things that you can't do by region. But communities want to see themselves protected, particularly in a time of potential anarchy. They trust each other more than they trust anybody else. So I could see a movement, whether that's called a federal system, whether it's part of a constitutional system, is less important than the actual power relationship. But the only way I see a willingness of either side to give up the idea of absolute power is if it doesn't appear achievable or attainable. And right now, the Taliban think they can take it. But if they can't, there may be factions within to say, if we can't win outright, what kind of deal can we strike? That's would be the time for real negotiations.
To follow up, Professor Maley, on this point, it would seem that if the government were interested in, one way to hedge possible Taliban takeover is to move at some point now to weaken the executive. Seems kind of counterintuitive, right? But if you weaken the power of the executive, at least formally, you create the opportunity, you create maybe stronger incentives for regional players to participate, to be stronger allies at the center if they don't see this sort of winner-take-all system that Professor Barfield has described at the center. Why hasn't the central government moved to change any of this right now, understanding the threat of Taliban takeover of a very centralized system?
I think it's in part because there's a very long-standing and durable conviction within at least elements of the Afghan political elite that a strong state is the solution to Afghanistan's problems. And I remember hearing this more than 25 years ago, emphatically from Syed Qasim Rishtiya, who was one of the architects of the 1964 constitution. I think it actually derives from a kind of Hobbesian view that in a fractious environment, it's necessary to have a common power to hold all others in awe. The difficulty with that, of course, is that if you have a process of state unraveling as Afghanistan experienced in the 1990s, and you then announce that your intention is to put a strong state, a centralized state into place, you create incentives for all sorts of people to struggle ferociously for control of that state, because they fear that if anyone else gets control of the state, they'll be able to use it to their own detriment. And so it tends to fuel a much more ferocious politics than otherwise one might have. And in a sense, I think some of the rather odd episodes that have occurred this year, the confrontation with Commander Alipur and then the ongoing controversy over Governor Lahmani, reflect in part a desire of the central authorities to find whatever mechanism they can at their disposal to assert that they are still a powerful force, even if it involves picking fights that might not seem to make all that much sense at a time when the Taliban is the main player about which they need to be concerned. But I think one of the reasons that also facilitates that kind of positioning is that the peace process itself is really not a peace process. It began as an American exit process, although it was dressed up as a peace process. It's substantially been degraded by strategic stalling on the part of the Taliban, who have no particular incentive to make any concessions at the moment. And I suspect if we reach the point that Tom Barfield was anticipating, where there might be a hurting stalemate at some point in the future, if there are then negotiations, it'll be in a very different kind of context from that which Doha or Istanbul would offer. In a way, I think it's a bit of a waste of time to invest too much in the mythology of that particular process when there are genuine incentives driving the parties in different directions at the moment. And what we really should be thinking about is how Western positioning might incentivize particular behaviours on the part of the different players, and what unintended consequences might flow from measures that external powers take. And one of the things that's actually disturbed me the most in the last year and a half really has been the extent to which Khalilzad and various presidents have been almost blithely indifferent to the psychological impact on the ground in Afghanistan of various statements and positions that they've adopted. People are watching all the time to see from which direction the wind is blowing, and that then disposes people to orient themselves in particular ways, because it's not rational to be on the losing side in a place like Afghanistan. And here I go back to Hobbes, who in Leviathan said, reputation of power is power. And I think quite a lot of what's going on at the moment is to do with an inchoate understanding on the part of at least some Afghan actors that they need to be able to project a reputation of power if they're able to save the situation.
Professor Ibrahimi, along those lines, if you're looking at these different groups and the projection of power that we've seen from the different groups, both within from the Taliban but also within the Afghan government side, there's many factions and who are represented in these negotiations, and they are by no means unified in their approach to these negotiations. And one of the issues that has really come up in recent years is the ethnicization of politics. And especially over the past 10 years, this has become particularly acute. I remember reading Professor Maley and Professor Barfield's work from 20 years ago, where they're describing a very different kind of Afghan society where ethnicity wasn't as salient as it is now in politics. Do you think that these kinds of constitutional reforms, suggested here, a parliamentary system, for example, could help de-ethnicize politics? What do you, of course, there's so much uncertainty. So the dynamics that Professor Maley, Professor Barfield, Dr. Yama have suggested, there's so much uncertainty about what's going to take place in the battlefield. We could argue that one of the reasons why these negotiations are important is not for the outcome that they produce, but for the opportunity for these players to get to know each other. But could this negotiations lead to a kind of de-ethnicization of politics in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that is often. There's probably emerging evidence now that over the past 20 years, ethnicity has become a lot more salient in Afghan politics, and this has to do with many ways in which the Afghan politics was structured. I think, and the centralization of power. In the way it concentrates all power in one office has also contributed. And I think there's also some form of bottom-up responses to that sort of national level politics. And many of those people who respond to politics at the national level are beginning to redraw their identities, and often ethnicity has become one of the more salient ones during this period. So now, looking forward, I think ethnicity is a major factor, but often people are not very explicit in talking about it. Let us take the example of centralization versus decentralization. I think there are often myths in Afghan publics, among Afghan political elites, in Afghan political imagination, that associate certain forms of political system with ethnic identity, politics, and interests. So one of those is, for example, that Pashtuns have an interest in a strong centralized state. Minorities would benefit from a decentralized parliamentary or federal system. So while I think there can be a strong argument that can be made pro or against either of these, but I think in Afghanistan, I think in recent years, we have seen a resurge in public culture where we talk about many issues. And unfortunately, this decentralization is not one of those issues that we can talk very freely about. Because the way Afghan political imagination sees this is, if you talk about decentralization or federalism, you might be easily condemned and called for treason and everything else, right? So I think looking forward, I think in a lot of ways, the Taliban and certain political groups in Kabul, they have a shared interest in centralization. And Taliban is a heavily centralized group, and they would like to reimpose that. They have a sort of Islamist imagination they would like to impose on the Afghan society from Kabul. And for them, pretty much like others, the communists in Kabul, a strong government is a vehicle for that social transformation. But I also see, I think, a lot depends on the de facto power relations that are likely going to develop in Afghanistan over the next months and years. While these issues are being raised, and I think they see greater convergence of agreements on the challenges that are resulting from such a heavily centralized system. But I think in Kabul, at least in Afghan languages, many Afghans are not very comfortable talking about this. and those who do and often remain on the fringes of the Afghan politics in public sphere, if you would like to call it that way. So I think the Taliban, when they come to power, they bring certain ethnic dimensions to their role in Afghan politics, being a predominantly Pashtun movement coming from the south. Despite the rhetoric of pan-Islamism or whatever, by virtue of their presence in Kabul, they make the space a lot more narrower for other groups like the Tajiks and the Hazaras and Uzbeks. And I think there's a lot of these issues that are already in people's mind, but I think it would be good to explore while in the midst of this uncertainty about the situation in the military fronts.
Jennifer, could I jump in on that point?
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and it brings to my mind another issue that was taken up by Dr. Ahmadi in his paper, which was the choice of electoral system. And here I think there are 2 points that stand out. One is that when we're talking about constitutional change, it's actually very important to be alert to the ways in which different components of a constitutional political system can have subtle interactions with each other, which need to be contemplated with the greatest of care before one goes down particular pathways, because the ramifications can be quite dramatic. And we actually see that in the choice of the single non-transferable vote system for elections within the Walesi Jirga. Specialists on electoral systems, I think, were very wary when it surfaced, because it is a system that rewards groups that can have very disciplined blocks of followers who can be tasked with splitting the votes between different candidates on a ballot paper in order to maximize the number of seats that come back. And we saw that hugely ethnicized when the seats went to Hazaras rather than Pashtuns in Ghazni at the time of the 2010 election that then led to the special court process and the political crisis which flowed from that. That was not because anyone, I think, set out to put in place an electoral system that would have this particular consequence, but it was a consequence that might have been identified had there been more time and more attention devoted to anticipating what the consequences of that particular choice might be. And in a sense, that this takes me back to a literature on institutional design from the 1990s. There was a very fine study of the theory of institutional design in a book edited by Robert Gooden, who argued that when one's looking at institutions, it's important to think of revisability, robustness, sensitivity to motivational complexity and variability when one's designing institutions, that it's in a sense not an activity for the faint-hearted, because one needs to show the utmost care in propagating particular institutions as a preferred choice, and one needs then to think how a recommendation in one area will intersect with recommendations that might arise in other areas. And there's been some very good work done, for example, by Professor Donald Horowitz, looking at the ways in which different electoral systems might either discourage or encourage ethnic entrepreneurship within a society. And they're not things that are necessarily terribly obvious at first glance, but which become clearer once one begins to probe into the possible ways in which electoral systems might play out on the ground.
Yes,
I think one of the things that needs to be brought up, which actually was not in the paper, was the absence of political parties in Afghanistan. And that was a defect going back to the '64 Constitution. It's been repeated under the current Constitution. And so when we look at the question of greater ethnization in Afghanistan, one of the reasons that encouraged that is there have been no political parties that might negotiate across ethnic blocs for practical reasons. So how are you going to divide up the parliament if you don't allow political parties? Is it any surprise that you got a Pashtun and non-Pashtun bloc? Similarly, if you were talking about negotiations, it would be, as we find in many democracies, easier to build a cross-ethnic coalition if you're able to push certain themes that intersect between those groups, that they agree to ally, even though they're not the same, they may have conflicting interests in other ways, but they create very powerful coalitions. And I believe this was certainly something the king was aware of, and it certainly seems to be something that both the presidents of Afghanistan under 2004 constitution are aware of, is that prevents the challenge to executive authority. It's one thing to talk about creating a parliamentary system, but without a mention of how do you have a parliamentary system without political parties? I think the Americans were somewhat unclear on this because the American Constitution makes no mention of political parties. And the founders of the United States were also, like constitutional writers in Afghanistan, believed that political parties were divisive, you shouldn't have them. However, the United States democracy immediately had very powerful and divisive political parties, and we've had two of them ever since. They change over time, but the parties are extremely powerful. The British Parliament depends upon political parties. How we can talk about an Afghan constitutional order that refuses to allow candidates to run under a party label. It's no wonder if you have 100 people running for parliament, it's only going to take you and your relatives and a few more people to be elected. But if you had 100 people running and a number of them said, we will throw our support behind a candidate of particular type who is recognized on the ballot as, you get a very powerful change in dynamics. So one of the things in terms of talking about constitutional change, it seems to me, is something, even though it's not considered constitutional, why has there never been an electoral law recognizing parties, allowing groups to organize as official political parties to run candidates? And there can never be a successful democracy in Afghanistan without allowing formal political parties. And neither the Taliban nor the Ashraf Ghani government has any interest in doing that. So it seems to me you're tinkering around the edges until, and the thing is, that doesn't have to be a fundamental constitutional change. It's a law. It only had to be a law under the 64 Constitution, only has to be a law now. It was a law that was never passed. So it seems to me that one of the defects right now is, and particularly if we're worried about the potential for civil war, the groups that we fall back on are those that happened in the 1990s, which are ethnic. It was interesting that in the Soviet period, the conflict was not ethnic, it was ideological. As soon as essentially the ideological regime collapsed, we find PDPA troops dividing between Tajik factions and Pashtun factions. In times of anarchy, Afghanistan tends to revert back to the local, back to the ethnic. And we move away from an ideological conflict, which is what we've kind of got now, like the Taliban saying, we're going to create this Islamic state, and the Republic side saying, no, we've got essentially a secular state with Islamic concerns. If it breaks down, I don't think any people are going to be kind of interested in these broader ideological questions. What they're going to be interested in is more questions of power, which was the great unraveling in the 1990s, which pushed back repowered ethnic groups that had not been, during the jihad against the Soviet, ethnic groups were not the key drivers. During the Civil War, they were. So we see alternative moves back and forth in Afghanistan from how people organize themselves. And one of the reasons for this is the absence of smaller scale political parties that would be designed to make deals and to govern, not to represent either particular leaders or particular extreme ideologies.
May I think that this inherent type of differences is not only confined to Afghanistan, but most of the countries of the world, they have different type of people, different cultures, ethnic groups, different languages. as Mr. Ibrahimi mentioned, I would say that Newton's third law of motion, it is not a bad thing if a country consists of different type of people. The problem starts from the point when you start denying that fact. The history of Afghanistan was very, very bad in this regard. And I would comment with apologies to Mr. Barfield. Yes, during the Soviet invasion, there was the ideological aspect of the whole situation was too much dominant, but deeply the ethnic issue was also embedded in that. And you see why the ethnic question was not raised at that time, because every community was preparing, though it was unconscious, but every ethnic group was preparing to manifest itself. So when the Uzbeks found that they are now enough strong to raise their voice, they started their voices. And then the Hazaras, same. And you don't find any strong Hazara voice when there was 8 different small parties. Their voice has become very strong when all these parties, they made a coalition, a single party, which was Hizb Wadat. Same as far as the Uzbeks are concerned. So now I would suggest that the scholars there in Afghanistan, it was a very good start. They should also explore the other unsaid you see aspects of Afghan society which has been taboo. And now I remember when I was Afghanistan, and I saw a lot of problem because of this, because I was one of the founders of the Afghanistan National Front, and the issue of decentralization started through a formal paper. It was 2010 when Afghanistan National Front was made. But the reaction was too high. Many people, they suffered because of that issue. I'm one of those. And you see, when you pronounce the F of the federalism, the people will behave you the same as the end of 18th century of the France. When the federal issue was there, somebody was talking, so they were charged with the treason. So now this has become the situation. As far as many people who raise the issue of very correctly, because a PR system of election is incomplete without the political parties. And then why it was not, let me tell you that Afghanistan's political party law here at the moment, it is one of the toughest in the region. But even though many political parties are registered there, but useless because they don't have any electoral role. Our esteemed rulers who came from the West, they don't have any root among the people. They don't have any political party. Among the Pashtun elites, the political parties are only 3 important parties: Taliban, Hikmatyar, and the liberal part of our Pashtun brothers. They were too much concentrated in Afghan Millat Party or Afghanistan Social Democratic Party. So what they did not scatter the other parties, but they also make the various faction of even Afghan Millat too, because they didn't have any political party and they did not allow any political party to be flourished. So now they are very much comfortable with this tribal type of lord who is ruling Afghanistan. How is it possible? You studied in the most advanced countries of the world, and you are talking about the about the democracy, various aspect of the democracy, but both the presidents, they don't have any political party. They did not even a single day try to make a political party because they don't believe in Afghanistan. Now see, as everybody knows that we are not going to face a you see, a smooth future, because as far as I see, just think that you are Taliban, and from the position of the Taliban, just think that what would be your reaction at that time. You resist against the Americans. 150,000 forces were there. You did not surrender. Now the Americans are leaving. The Americans whose top agenda was to prevent the Taliban from coming back to power, and now they are negotiating with as a political important stakeholder with the Taliban. So now they are too much encouraged, and they believe that they can take by force, which is very wrong. I would say this is not 90s. A takeover of Taliban is not a very easy question, because this is my job, and I have a very deep contacts with a lot of people in the north. Very high level of preparation is going on to resist against the Taliban. One. Second, this equation of the various equation of power, the balance of between the various communities of Afghanistan is not acceptable for the region. It will very badly involve the region once again. And I also believe that this time, this probable civil war will not last very long, probably 4 or 5 years. But at that time, if we will not address these important and key issues now, the distribution of power, the most genuine way, at that time, I'm afraid that the people might think that either we can live with the Taliban with so much differences in a single geography or not. So that's why to preserve the integrity of Afghanistan, this is very important that all of us inside Afghanistan, outside Afghanistan would concentrate the most practical and the genuine way. Not by force. It is not possible. Why there should be ethnic number 1, ethnic number 2, ethnic number 3? The Pashtun should be always the head of a state because they are the owner. Just tell me why Afghanistan doesn't have any census. Why Afghanistan doesn't have any organized, electoral system. These are all the fact system. And I know I was involved in 2004 constitutional Louis Jirga. I was there. This was a fact process. This constitution was imposed. It is fabricated. Even this is not the constitution which was designed, which was drafted by the constitutional committee. So I would say that this is inhuman. Pashtun should be ethnic number 1, Tajik should be number 2, Hazaras number 3, Uzbeks number 4. Why shouldn't Nuristani should be the president of Afghanistan? Why? And why there is why we are developing this unhealthy trend to Afghanistan? This is creating rift among the people of Afghanistan, and it will. We are actually cultivating the seeds of enmity. And this time the reaction will be very, very strong. Let me tell you, God bless Afghanistan and his people. I think this approach from the Taliban side and from the side sitting in Kabul, I would pray that our elites of our Pashtun brothers, political elites, they would change their 1900s century theory of statehood. This is the only way. The coexistence is everywhere. Everywhere they have addressed their issues, their differences. Why we cannot solve? We can also change it, solve it, but we need to change our basic idea of statehood, and we should adopt the idea of coexistence. Thank you.
So along these lines, this is a very important opportunity right now. And, I think Dr. Yasa has articulated desire for many to see changes in the way power is organized. And the way that this paper discusses this is through institutional changes, right? And so I think the question for all of you really is thinking, can institutions change society, or must society be driving this? And let me just give you an example. Professor Barfield has raised the issue of political parties. And many people say, well, you have these political parties in Afghanistan. Of course, you can't have political parties, playing a stronger role. This was the argument 20 years ago, right? That these are all ethnic factions and they're strongmen factions. And if you bring them into the political system, you'll just have more war. So the consequence of this is that 20 years later, you still have the same factions. They're still organized the same way, and they're not participating in politics in a formal way because the political party law has kept them out. The SNTV system that Professor Maley has discussed intentionally weakens the role of political parties for the fear that we saw 20 years ago. So in order to move beyond this ethnic nature of parties, this factional nature of parties, you need a political party law that actually brings these parties, that creates opportunities for new parties to emerge within the political system. And that has not occurred. So, thinking very broadly about this role of institutions, and it's a really confusing moment right now, I think, because we're talking about all these wonderful ideas of constitutional design, Dr. Ahmadi's paper, and it's a question I want to raise in a few minutes about religious differences, Hanafi jurisprudence, Jafari jurisprudence, how these can coexist within the constitutional framework. But, to what extent can these institutions be the foundation of a future when we're in the middle of this very difficult conflict? Is now the time to come to a consensus on this? And why haven't these factions outside who are not the Taliban come to a greater understanding of what a future state could look like? Why isn't there more discussion of this kind of institutional issues? Professor Maley has also suggested that this is because of this need to consolidate the states, need to preserve the executive, but now seems to be the time to be having these discussions. Dr. Ibrahimi.
Bill, would like to go first?
No, please go ahead, Niamat.
Well, I mean, this is, I think, really a critical question. I think while, Afghanistan is in the middle of uncertainty because of the conflict and military fronts, I think the institutional question will be, I think, a key to the future of the country. Let me tell you a quick example I saw recently. Last weekend when we saw that horrific school bombing in Barfield targeting the Hazara women and girls, there's some people in Jalalabad. They went out holding a sign saying, "I am a Hazara Pashtun." Okay, so for many people, this was an orderly, expression of solidarity by the Pashtun brothers. To an attack that has targeted, Hazara girls and young children so badly. But many people miss the point. That rally, that group of people was organized by Hambastagi Milli Afghanistan, which is a left-leaning political party in Afghanistan. And those parties were the only one that had the appeal, the organizational capacity, the network to appeal across ethnic boundaries in Afghanistan. Now, this is something which was close to my heart for many years when I was in Kabul. I was looking at it is not that attempts were not made. I think for those of us who are familiar in Kabul, there were attempts to build multinational, multi-ethnic coalitions around programmatic ideas. And there were also attempts to discuss new programs of development, the transformation of the country. And there were also attempts to reform this old, ethno-factional networks. Attempts to reform Hizbullah, Jimbish, Jamiyat, all of this were by younger people in the early 2000s. I saw that, right? So what happened was that when they designed an institution which discriminated against the political parties, right? And literally turned political parties into irrelevant actors, right? And then in addition to this, what they did was that they used patronage, okay, from the presidential palace to buy the loyalty of a strongman. Okay, the argument was that we don't want to have political parties because they are, these ethnic entrepreneurs and warlords and whatnot, right? But in practice, what they did was that they killed the institutional environment for the development and revitalization of political parties which existed. I think it exists now in Afghanistan. We have seen younger people, for example, Afghanistan 1400, right? This was a genuine political party that attempted to become a national party in its scope. It had membership, it had grand ideas. What happened was that they all were victim of this patronage politics, the division of the 2014 and 2019 presidential elections. These were two small groups to resist this massive changes that were coming underway. So I think now going forward, I think Afghanistan needs to have this debate, either a presidential or parliamentary or federal system. I think that debate is quite an important one, but it is also, I think, important that we shift the debate, the blame. Often it is easily directed towards ethnic entrepreneurs, or sometimes Afghan society is too backward to have this kind of national political parties. But if you look closely, I think there were many efforts, that were killed, in infancy by this environment which was created in Afghanistan during this period.
Professor Maley.
Yeah, one can always come up with arguments that now is not the right time to talk about institutions, but I think that's actually a very dangerous kind of attitude to take, particularly when one has in Afghanistan a young population that's been influenced by globalization in a way that no previous generation has, which creates scope for a certain amount of imagination and creativity when one's talking about future institutions, which really are going to impact on the lives of those young people much more than elderly academics in the West like me. Having said that, I think there are 2 points, however, that come up as significant obstructions. One is a collective action problem, that even if an existing institution may be broadly dysfunctional in its impact on the practice of politics and social life in Afghanistan, there are certain people who benefit very strongly from the existing framework. The people who are embedded in a kind of neo-patrimonial structure, which is rewarding both financially and politically, they can be expected to fight much more strongly to retain the existing system than even the larger number of people who might be disadvantaged by the existing system but have so many problems in their day-to-day lives that they don't have much time to devote to politics. So there's that classic kind of problem that arises. There's also the problem of how far one can go, because when one has an existing constitutional structure, typically one will find within it mechanisms in place specifying how an amendment of that framework can be accomplished. And I think there is a danger, which was very obvious in the material that emanated from the State Department at the time that the idea of the Istanbul Conference was mooted, that one can simply throw out everything that's been done for 20 years and come up with blithe notions of wiping the slate clean without that necessarily having some pretty bad unintended consequences, really. That the danger is that one can inadvertently trash the whole idea of constitutionalized politics and instead create the impression that whoever gets power can just put in place a set of arrangements that will be suitable to that power holder or set of power holders. And in a sense, the whole point of constitutionalism is to limit the exercise of power. That's why I think it's very difficult, incidentally, in the Taliban context, because they've not shown any enthusiasm ever for limitations being imposed on their exercise of power through law and things like that. They really don't bring a constitutionalist mindset to discussions at all. But that doesn't mean that it's not important to talk about these kinds of issues. And I think Dr. Ahmadi's made a great contribution by putting some of these issues on the table for us.
And along these lines, getting back to Dr. Ibrahimi's point about, society versus institutions. I mean, even when individual groups had strong grassroots incentives, they were beginning to form coalitions in society. It became very difficult to translate that kind of momentum into any kind of sustained political movement, because the institutions prevented these groups, prevented new parties from emerging. So we may have Hambastagi Milli, organizing, but this will be, under the current law, their ability to aggregate, to build, to create a larger kind of consensus is really constrained by the formal institutional rules. And so touching on this institutional question again, I want to get to a point that, Professor Barfield has mentioned federalism. We've had this discussion of federalism. The paper talks about decentralization, doesn't, as many of you noted, doesn't move towards federalism. I think maybe there's a sense that this is just too much of a jump, given the current political constraints. But any kind of move towards decentralization or towards federalism in Afghanistan would require an elevation of subnational units. And this is an important question in terms of thinking about the future. And Professor Maley, you've said that we should be thinking about these issues. There's always an important time to think about them. I think it was you who talked about the proliferation of provinces. Professor Barfield's mentioned this as well, that there were a certain number of regions, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the number of provinces has really proliferated. When I started doing research in Afghanistan, more than 15 years ago, there were about 16,000 villages. That's what the Central Statistics Office calculated. As the amount of aid was allocated per village, the number of villages suddenly jumped to more than 30,000. In the matter of 3 years, the number of villages doubled magically. The number of provinces has increased. At one point in time, the IDLG, the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, didn't even know how many districts there were in the country because these districts kept proliferating. So if we're going to elevate subnational units in terms of decentralization and federalism, the United States, by way of comparison, has 50,000 subnational units. This not only includes local government units, but trash collection units, school districts, about 30,000 local government units. That's the same amount as Afghanistan has. These are very difficult to sustain fiscally, financially, right? So there has to be a kind of rethinking, I think, about the role of the province, how many provinces, but this is a very sensitive issue right now. What do you see any kind of movement on this? Are there people thinking about this right now in Kabul? How can this kind of issue be addressed if the country is going to move towards the kind of decentralized system that Dr. Ahmadi talks about, towards a more federal system that some of you have suggested?
Well, in 2018, the IDLG did put out a very substantial document in Persian, which attempted to create at least a kind of baseline from which one could begin to make some assessments about structures within the state. To me, one of the great problems really is the dearth of non-controversial vocabulary in this particular area, because every kind of expression which to Western political scientists seems entirely uncontroversial runs the risk of raising red flags in different circles in Afghanistan. And it seemed to me one of the ways in which one could usefully look at this is not even talk about centralization or decentralization, but instead about matching the capacities of the state to the needs of the people. And that then does open discussion of a whole range of other important issues, such as the fiscal sustainability of responsibilities. Now, we have a federal system in Australia, and for decades there have been significant problems arising from the fact that the states have responsibility for areas where costs tend to rise quickly, such as hospital care, with increasing medical technology of a sophisticated variety being available, at the same time that they have a taxing capacity which guarantees at best a very slow growth in taxes, because tax revenues, because they don't rise in the kind of semi-automatic fashion that income taxes can generate greater volumes of revenue. And we have this expression of vertical fiscal imbalance in Australia to describe that particular problem. So it may well be that there are ways in which one can try to unpack the issue of the distribution of power within the state even further than current discussion has gone, but from a functional point of view, to try to explore ways in which the needs of the people, which are quite complex, can nonetheless be matched by state activities. In that sense, it may be interesting to look back at some earlier post-2001 exercises like the National Solidarity Program, which did have its difficulties, but which saw local organisations having much more say in the spending of at least some resources than otherwise might have been the case. And that didn't seem to raise the same kind of red flags that some other vocabularies did. I'm not saying that there's an easy answer to this particular problem, because the discussion is one which is entwined and entangled with notions of power and identity as well, and that's always a complicating factor. But I remain optimistic that one day we'll find a way of trying to unpack these issues effectively.
Okay. So, moving on, I think, to this issue of religious accommodation. It's something that's mentioned quite a lot in the paper, and not something that we've talked about. And of course, these issues of religious difference often map onto the kind of ethnic differences that we've spoken about today. But do any of you think that there is a compelling argument to be made with the Taliban, using the language that Dr. Ahmadi, who's a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence, I think quite eloquently talks about the role of, the different religious madhabs, what role that they can play in politics. And it's a way of coming to terms with the Islamic nature of the Constitution. And of course, that the Republic and the Taliban have two very different visions of what the role Islam should play in politics. But I was curious to know what your thoughts were on the integration of these different schools of thought in future constitutional orders, or whether this could be something that unites people more than divides, if we're going to speak about religious perspectives rather than ethnic perspectives.
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. This is also one of the very important aspects of Afghan politics, no doubt. And Dr. Ahmadi is very good in this issue. And at the moment, though we have ulama councils, and which has almost some sort of advisory role, or nothing more than that, but they time to time they interfere on the various issues. At the moment, we have in our constitution only a couple of clauses about this, which says that every follower of every religions, they are free to practice their religion regardless of whatsoever. And about the Shias and the Sunnis, it says that the followers of the Shia faith, which is Jafari, is also said that Fiqh Jafari. So their religion or sect is also recognized. But when there is some issues in the court between the Shias and the Sunnis, then the court will act upon the verdicts of the Hanafi sect. But it is again very good, because in that regard, I don't see too much differences. As I'm in touch with Dr. Ahmadi, I read a couple of his articles about this. This is a very good approach. But now the issue is, this is also the part of, you see, either you will, the issue is either you will solve all these issues institutionally, or you will solve it through a very flawed type of constitutional setup. See, in Afghanistan, it is happening. That is the issue. Like Ibrahimi said, it was a very good practice. And I would say that in Afghanistan, the left people, when they ruled 14 years, I think they were dealing with this issue. I don't say about the other aspects of their governance, but they were dealing with the issue of ethnicity and the religion very, very cleverly and very smartly. For example, they have recognized all the ethnic group. And in Afghanistan, it was in the constitution, there was only one clause that the official religion of Afghanistan is Islam, and that's all. And all the followers of all the religions, they are free to practice. And there will be, the courts will accordingly deal with the issue by the law, which were mostly the civic law. Now, in coming days, how the situation will be folded, I would say that Taliban will very radically will deal with this issue, because some of the participants who met directly in Moscow, and they discuss it behind the scene, this issue. And the Taliban, they bluntly say that we don't believe in such divisions. There will be only one religion in Afghanistan. If we will recognize the Shia religion, so then we will have to recognize the Salafis, then we have to recognize the Ismailis, then we have to recognize the other small school of thoughts in Islam. They don't believe in this. But anyway, I would say that the thing which I've been saying on this vertical distribution of power on the vertical part of the political system, it can address this issue very easily. And there are some good models in the world, like you can see toward even Indonesia. You see, in one province, you got Kartia, I think, they have king. Grandfather was king, son was king, and now grandson is the king. And he has the constitutional protection. In Aceh, just see the people, they had the referendum and they say we want a Sharia law. And it was doing all with a very good institutional, setup. So it is quite possible if the Taliban would step down a little bit, 1 or 2 steps. Afghanistan is the home of different type of people. How will you rule by force? I don't know. See the 21st century and this stone age type of approach. I would say that there is only one way, that to institutionally address this issue and let the people to practice their faith, their religion, which was inherited by their father, grandfather, grandfather. Now they believe in certain religions and faiths. So that's why Dr. Ahmadi's approach in that regard is much better, much better. Thank you.
So, I think we've had a very long conversation today. We have just a few minutes left, and I want to wrap things up with really asking all of you to share your perspective on whether whether this changes are possible, where you see the Taliban moving. We've had so many interesting discussions, and on the one hand, Afghanistan is of course facing a very dire situation, but on the other hand, this possibility of change is an opportunity for all of us to rethink these institutions. So on the one hand, it's very difficult. On the other hand, we see these very creative proposals at a time when we know that institutional change may be possible. And so I'm going to ask all of you to sort of conclude with your thoughts of where you see things going in terms of both the institutional change and the willingness of the Taliban to accept this kind of institutional reform and accommodation that we're describing. So Dr. Ibrahimi, I'll begin with you, because we ended with you in the very beginning.
Thank you. I'll be quite brief. I might also quickly comment on the issue of women's rights. I think you mentioned, and I think here I see Dr. Ahmadi's approach is fundamentally different from that of the Taliban. The Taliban have a literal interpretation of Sharia law with regards to women, and whereas Dr. Ahmadi is proposing a more current thinking, which is trying to see Islamic injunctions with regards to women in its historical context and bring in the issues of public interest and all of those things. So I think there is a lot of progressive thinking here, I think, which must be really appreciated and promoted. But I think we should also see evidence of change on that front from the Taliban. And here, I think my concern is that for the Taliban, the issue of women is really a centrally important one. And they would like to see many of them try to reverse the changes in their view that were imposed, as they would say, on Afghan society over the past 20 years. And one of those areas I would like to reverse is, I think, the issue of women's rights, because they were such a central factor in their propaganda. And I think, it would be very hard for them to take a step back on the issue of women's rights. And on where things are going, I think, it is, Afghanistan is in a very, very difficult situation. And I think a lot depends on international support post-withdrawal. And I think while many issues, unfortunately, will have to be determined in the battlefield, but I think it is useful to engage in this conversation. This very imaginative thinking, at least to contribute to what are possible ways out of the conflict.
So if I understand you correctly, you don't see the Taliban accommodating on some of these fundamental issues?
Well, I don't have many reasons to believe, unfortunately. I mean, I haven't seen a reformed Taliban yet.
Professor Barfield.
I too do not see the Taliban changing at the moment. I think one of the useful things that comes out of papers like this and discussion is that too much at the moment is focused on either the Taliban or sort of the Ashraf Ghani government, neither of which could probably win a majority of the Afghan people in a fair vote. However, the more ideas that are out there, so that it isn't a choice between these two different institutions, the greater the possibilities that a third alternative might come up. I would note that Afghanistan, unfortunately, is now close to 100 years of an unresolved dispute, of which the Taliban represent one side, the Ashraf Ghani another. Most of these reforms that the Taliban condemn were not internationally induced. They were proposed by Amanullah in the 1920s. And what we've seen is switches from governments on one side, revolutions that overthrow them, 29 becoming reactionary, 78 becoming secularist, leftist, 96 back to Taliban religion, 2001 open kind of Amanullah sort of model, and now we're back again. What we have is an unresolved conflict in Afghan society. As was pointed out by other speakers, this is not a conflict that has disappeared in other societies. I sit in the United States, where we just saw off 4 years of Trump, and many of us in the United States feel that we have people that we didn't much understand before. But what we didn't suffer from was a collapse of the state and a collapse of the nation because of that. Afghanistan has never resolved this dispute between the two ideologies. But on the other hand, it's a state that suffered from a radical move from one to another, neither of which has become stable. I think one of the things that we need to look for now is the Afghan population, majority, slight majority, has been born since 2001. Too many of the people engaged in this conversation are people like myself, or the people that rule Afghanistan or sit at Doha, that are really old. We do not represent this new population. And we have yet to hear where that population stands. That's one of the reasons I think that even if the Taliban take Kabul, they would find it extremely difficult to govern. They found it almost impossible in the mid-90s. I think they would find it impossible now, but that doesn't say much for stability of Afghanistan. But I think we need to break out of the traditional ways that we look at structures of constitutions in Afghanistan, which I think Mahdi is doing in his paper, to get the broadest possible things out there, not because they can create a framework for peace now, but that in the future, we have better ideas, as opposed to, it seems, for a historian, it's great. I don't have to learn very much new. It seems to be the same thing happening all the time. I would like to see, for Afghanistan's sake, that this old pattern be totally broken and replaced.
Great, thank you. Professor Maley.
Tom's comment there reminds me of Edmund Burke's saying that a state is not governed, that must be perpetually conquered. And I think that's true, but sometimes a state can be ruled without being governed, and that's a very dangerous kind of scenario in Afghanistan at the moment. Just picking up the point that you raised, Jennifer, about religion earlier and where that might fit into this discussion, from a slightly different context, it brought to my mind Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass and the exchange between Alice and Humpty Dumpty, which I will quote. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful voice, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master, that's all. And I think that is a window also into the thinking of the Taliban about religion. I don't think they're interested in scholarly discourse and the refutation of their views by learned reference to text. I think they have a certain mindset which is very firmly set in place I had an aunt in Australia who was a bit like that herself, and it tends to divide the world into us plus the people who are wrong. And in that sense, and I'll conclude with this point, I think there's a very important point that Dr. Ahmadi makes in his paper, where he says, of course, there is no place for civil society in their discourse. In the Taliban discourse, the structure of power is highly centralized and absolute. And I think that's true. It remains the case that their mindset in the late 1990s was totalitarian, but they didn't have the instrumentalities of the state available to them, which would have allowed them to behave in the way in which other totalitarian regimes historically have behaved. But I don't think the absence of the mindset has set in since that period of time. I think they still have a very rigid view of how the world should be structured, and their proceeding to try to give effect to it could be very dangerous for people on the ground in Afghanistan.
Great, thank you. Dr. Yasa, we have about 1 minute left.
Yeah, I am glad that today I was one of the participants of this wonderful meeting, and I wish Dr. Ahmadi wish him good luck, and he has a very wonderful paper, though he himself has already said in one of his interviews that we don't have a common language with the Taliban. And from the women rights up to the civic values, democracy, elections, we don't have a single type of similarity. So his interview is on the record, but I still wish him from the bottom of my heart that he should continue his research work. And thank you very much for having me in such a wonderful conversation. Whatever will happen, but we should be the good people from among the international community, and as well as from Afghanistan itself. There should be a continuous type of conversation, interaction, and I think we can learn a lot from the distinguished persons like Barfield, like Professor Maley, and my friend Mr. Ibrahimi. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. This was a real pleasure and honor to learn so much from you during the course of this conversation. And thanks to our colleagues at AISS for putting this all together. This is quite a delightful opportunity to have this discussion. And just to quote Professor Barfield once more, that having these ideas in circulation is really important. Whatever happens to them is really up to the people of Afghanistan. But let's hope that it's up to the people of Afghanistan, right? That the decision about these ideas, but having more circulation of these ideas, I think is quite important for the future. And I'd encourage all of you to download Dr. Ahmadi's paper, An Assessment of the Possibility of Producing Consensus Within the Parliamentary and Decentralized System of Democracy in Afghanistan. It is a very creative paper. It is one of the most impressive that I have seen, most unique. It really presents a concrete pathway towards accommodation, towards developing a modus vivendi for the future. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to our audience for being with us today. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
But thanks to you.